Hello and welcome to Synthesis and Synthesizers Basic course. My name is Udi, and in this course I'm going to teach you all the basics of synthesis. And the course is intended for people that have no experience or don't know synthesizers, but I'm sure that people that know something about synthesizer can still learn a few things here. And this course is going to be a little bit different maybe in a way because I'm going to use several different synthesizers to show you all kinds of ideas. And I think that will be a fun way to see what is common and what is maybe not common between different synthesizers. I'm going to use some emulations of old analog synthesizers like Prophet. I'm going to use Massive, which is really a wavetable synthesizer, very popular. I'm also going to use SynthMaster 2, which is really an excellent tool, and it really is easy to understand, and it's an amazing synthesizer in my mind. And also Pigments by Arturia, which is really incorporates all the knowledge and all the experience that Arturia have in the synthesis world into one great looking tool. And actually, this is one of the best synthesizers to learn synthesis, and you'll see why as we go along with this course. So to start off this course, this lesson will be a very general, but still you'll be able to understand all the basic parts of any synthesizer. So let's get started. So our journey begins with an oscillator. Oscillator is the part of the synthesizer that actually creates the sound, and it oscillates. And when we're talking about oscillation, we need to really understand that the way we hear is by movement of air hitting our eardrum. And this is really what we are hearing, right? The eardrum is just moving in a certain way, in a certain frequency, and this is what eventually interprets in our mind to sound. And oscillator is a generator of wave forms. And if we look here at the oscillator of Prophet, we might find it hard to imagine what the waveform looks like. But if we take, for example, SynthMaster, and let me close all these other synthesizers. If we go here, we can see the actual waveform. And if we select a sine wave, which is really one of the, maybe the simplest waveform, this is the shape. And so over time, this oscillator generates a waveform. And in turn, that waveform is being amplified by the amplifier part of the synthesizer, and that's what makes the sound. So in order for us to really understand this, I think we need to see it. So let's hear and let's see how this really works. So I'm going to play a C note, and this is what we hear. But if we open an oscilloscope, and this is a tool that you can find very easily from Melda Production or elsewhere. It's a free freeware, so you don't need to spend anything. Let's see. Right, so this is exactly what we expected. And if I change the waveform to something else, again and again. But what do I mean when I say that it is over time? The wave is just generating over time and repeats itself. So if we go, let me close that. And if we go and actually record a note, and I'll do it right away here, we'll see exactly what I mean. So I'm going to just draw a C note, and we'll play it. Nice. So now if I actually render this, and I can do it with Cubase here very easily, render in place, we'll see the waveform. So let's take a closer look. And closer. Right, so this is exactly what I was playing with the synthesizer. So if we open the synthesizer, this is the waveform. And here it is repeating itself. So this is the way an oscillator plays. And it just generates a waveform over time, and then it is amplified by the amplifier, and that's what we hear. So very simple. Now, in synthesizers, the oscillator is actually coupled with the keyboard. And so when we play something, the note that we play is really then the base frequency of our oscillator. And let me exemplify that by using a different waveform like a sine. And let's open up just a simple equalizer. And we'll see what I mean. So if I take just a simple equalizer here, and I play just a C note, we can see that the dominant, or maybe pretty much the only frequency that is playing is indeed a C note. And if I play another C note, just an octave up, and another one, or maybe just any note. So every time I play a note, the oscillator will play that note on that frequency. So you have to understand that in synthesizers, the oscillator is coupled with the keyboard, and it is tracking our keyboard. So that's a fundamental concept to understand. Right. So that's really the very first and basic part of any synthesizer, because we need to generate sound. And let's have a look at other synthesizers. So let's have a look at Prophet. So Prophet is really this is an emulation of the analog physical synthesizer, and it is a truly simple synthesizer. It has all the basic parts, but still can sound very, very good and full. And we'll see it throughout the course. So here is our oscillator, and this is the base frequency that we are working on. And let me just go to the basic preset here, just a simple one oscillator. And we can see exactly what's happening here. So this is a different waveform. It's not a sine wave, and it has more frequencies. So different waveforms creates different frequencies over our spectrum here. And that's really what is different from one sound to another, the other frequencies that we have. So a trumpet sounds different from a flute, right? So it's both the different frequencies, but also the waveform. And so, sorry. So, and now we see that we have only two options here. We have our sawtooth and a pulse here, or a square wave. And we can go back to our oscilloscope to see the waveform. Right, and so this is Prophet. And if we take a look at Pigments, And again, we have a graphical view here, and we can see the waveform. So in Pigments, we have two engines. One can be used, or both of them can be used, but either can be wavetable or analog. And when we are using wavetable, so this is a different kind of oscillator, and we'll go through all the different types of oscillators in our next lesson. But for now, let's just have a look in 3D and see what it means. It means that we have several waveforms, and we can just position ourselves anywhere in between. Let me just make sure I'm on Pigments. Yes. And you can see the wave changes here. The waveform changes. If I go back to 3D to 2D, right. So this is our oscillator, and in engine 2 we already have an analog set here, analog oscillator, and I'll turn off our wavetable, and we can see all the basic forms here, like sine, like triangle, sawtooth, and so on. So moving on to the next very important part, we're going to see how filters really play a part, an important part in synthesis. So this sound is not in any way filtered out, and when we look at the or spectrum of frequencies with our EQ or spectrum analyzer, let's see what we have here. So we have lots of frequencies, and especially we can see that we have a lot of frequencies just around here, around the high area. And the filter is really a device that will take out some of the frequencies, or maybe boost a little some of the frequencies. And we'll see it again in our lesson that is dedicated to filters. But for now, let's see what the filter actually does. So if I turn our cutoff knob here, so we can see that we are just cutting off some of the highs. And a filter can be also on the other way. So we can cut the lows. So our main types here are either low pass, meaning we are letting the low frequencies pass, or maybe high pass, we're letting the high frequency pass. But we also have other types like notches, for example. Let's see what that does. Band passes that will pass only the middle. So we were cutting lows and highs and so on. So this is our filter. And any filter will also have a resonance knob. And the resonance will just boost some of the frequencies right next to the cutoff point. So let's take low pass again, and let's play with the resonance, and we'll see what happens. So we can see that we are boosting this area here, and in our EQ it's also very easy to spot. This is our resonance. So why do we need that resonance? Well, again, that's a way for us to shape the sound. And most of the time you'll see in synthesis people automate the resonance and automate the filter as well as other parameters. And I'll show you how that works in a moment. So I think just to have some fun, let's try that out. So in order for us to automate the cutoff point here, we can use something that is called LFO. And usually in such courses, the LFO is being introduced in a later stage, but I think just for the fun of it, let's have a look at that. So an LFO is a type of oscillator, but it's not in any way something that you can hear. We are using that oscillator to oscillate, to move other parameters over time. So let's see how it works. So in our case here, we have LFO1, for example, and you can see the dot just moving back and forth, just moving. And let's try and use that to automate our cutoff. So I'm going to LFO1, and I'll just boost that just a little bit. And immediately we see the LFO in action. Very nice. So any LFO will also have a rate, the rate that it just oscillates. So I can have it faster or maybe slower. But in our case, we are synced to our DAW, to our host. And my host is in 120 BPM, 120 BPM. So that's the sync here. And we can see, so how does it sound? And I can also have the resonance automated in the same way. So we can take LFO 2, for example, and have the resonance, and you can see it just growing and shrinking. Right, so this is how our filter works. So let's get everything back to its default. Nice. So many of the synthesizers will have several filters, not just one. And you can use them to filter out the frequencies of one particular oscillator, or maybe two or more oscillators. So I can have, for example, filter 2 filter out the frequencies coming from oscillator 2 and or 3 and so on. So to see that, let's try and use Synth Master. So in Synth Master, again, this is pretty simple. This is our oscillator, and let's select a different waveform, for example, the sawtooth. And we can see all the frequencies playing. And I'll use filter 1 here. But I can also have filter 2 play. So I can turn it on. Let's see what filter 2 looks like. And in our case here, with Synth Master, I can have the filters go either in series, parallel, or split. So series meaning filter 1 will, all the sound will go through filter 1 from oscillator 1 and oscillator 2. And then it will be routed to filter 2. And only then will move along the chain here. But I can also have it in parallel, meaning I have oscillator 1 and oscillator 2 playing. Both of them are summed up, split again into filter 1 and filter 2, and then summed up again. But I can have it as a split, meaning I have oscillator 1 going through filter 1 and oscillator 2 going through filter 2. And I can actually have two different waveforms playing from these two oscillators. So the next very important part is an envelope. And let's see how envelopes work and why do we need envelopes. So up until now, we've generated some sound using our oscillators, and we filter out some of the frequencies to shape our sound. But we do need a way to shape this sound over time. And what I mean is that right now, when I play something with my keyboard, then the sound immediately goes to its maximum value. And when I stop hitting the key, when I just release my finger from the keyboard, the sound stops immediately. And we know that that's not really the case with sounds, with usable sounds, and with instruments, and especially with real instruments. Sometimes we want to have the sound evolve and over time, start quiet and then build up, or maybe start strong and then fade out. And the way to do it with synthesizers is by using envelopes. And envelopes shapes or describes the sound over time. And it has 4 different parameters: A, D, S, R. A is our attack. How fast do we want to get to our maximum volume if we are using the envelope on our sound, on our oscillator? How fast will it take for our sound to get to its maximum volume? And let's hear that. So this is my envelope here, and this is my attack time. And I can just shape that here, and let's hear how it sounds. And right now with SynthMaster, I already have my envelope coupled with my volume of my voice here. So this is really by default. I can see ADSR envelope 1 is affecting my voice volume. So it's set up here, but I'll show you the same idea in other synthesizers in a minute. So let's hear that. Yeah, the reason that we can't really hear anything is, or really feel the change here, is because the attack time is not prominent enough. And now, and I can sync the envelope to my DAW, to my host here, and I can see the lines here, and I can snap to a grid, for example. So the attack really represent the time it will take the sound to get to its maximum volume. And we can see it here. You can see the buildup. Now, the other parameter is actually the sustain. I'm jumping over the decay because the sustain is important here. Sustain is the volume or the value that we want to have for sustained, for our ongoing sound. So we can have the sound start slow, build up, and stay at that same volume, but we can also say, hey, I want to get to some sort of a maximum volume and then drop to a sustained level. So let's see that. So the sustain here, you can see it here. That's my sustain. I can just get it to be half from the maximum volume. And then the decay is the time amount to get into that point. And so I can have something that looks like this. I will start very slow, get to my maximum volume, then drop to a sustained level, and then eventually when I release my keyboard, then the sound will fade away over time that is defined by the release. So this is the attack, decay, sustain, and release. Let's hear it. So you can see here in my equalizer that we start very slowly to build up our volume, and then we drop a little, and then we are releasing. Let me get that more, let's say, let's get the release time more visible here, so you can, and we'll get the sustain level really almost to nothing. So this is very easy to see. We are starting slowly, building up, then dropping to our sustained level. We are staying, as long as I'm pressing the key, I'll be in the sustained level, and then when I release the key, then the sound will fade away over time. Let's have a look at another synthesizer, Pigments. And Pigments is really easy to understand and learn because it's really visual. So let's see that. So I have my analog engine here, and let's have the cutoff and resonance back to normal. And now let's try and use our envelopes. So right now, the same with Synth Master, the first envelope here is already coupled and defined to be our VCA, our amplifier envelope. And this is the default setting, so nothing special. And if I get the release to, let's say, sorry, the attack to, let's say, half a second, so you can see that the orange dot here, it takes half a second to get to its maximum value here. And if I drag this down, you can see the sustain level going to, let's say, 30% here. And then the release time will be, I don't know, let's take 1.5 seconds. So let's see and hear what's going on. Right, so I played a note. It took about half a second to get to its maximum value, and then we dropped. And then when I released the finger from the keyboard, it took 1.5 seconds for the sound to fade away. Right, so this is how envelopes work. And envelopes can be used not only with the oscillators, not only with volumes. It can work with anything that we want to shape over time. And it can also be used for the filters. So let's have a look at that. So let's try and have envelope 2 define how our filter is behaving over time. So for example, this will be our setting. And let me get the first envelope back to something more usable. Right, and now let's have the cutoff being modulated by envelope 2. And I'll go here to envelope 2 and just get that all the way up. So now envelope 2 is completely affecting our filter cutoff. Let's see how that works. So we can see what's happening here. When I'm pressing the key, the filter is behaving in a certain way over time. So let's have the attack real slow, like 1 second. And what we see here, we see that we are starting with the cutoff at a certain point, and then the filter opens up to the right. So more frequencies are being allowed to pass. But I can have that on, completely opposite direction. So you can see here that I'm affecting the envelope 2, I'm affecting the filter by envelope 2 in a positive way, going to the right, going into the positives. But I can do something else. I can go all the way to -1. Right, and let me show you the same idea with, for example, with Prophet. So Prophet is a fairly simple synthesizer, and you can see that we have oscillator 1 here, and let's hear it. And right now our filter here is set to its default. So this is my cutoff here, and this is my resonance, and this is the envelope amount. And in this particular synthesizer, the envelope, the filter envelope, is built in to the filter. This is my attack, decay, sustain, and release. And in fact, I have a different envelope already built into my amplifier here. So we can see both of these ideas very easily here. So let's try and play with the filter. So first, I'm going to get the envelope amount to its maximum value. So the effect of this envelope will be very, very visible and very prominent. So let's get the attack here. And we need to get the cutoff. Just going back. And now what happens is that when I press a key, it takes a little bit of time for the filter to open up. And I can have the sustain level all the way, or the other way, just shut it down. So what really happens is, again, the sustain level is the level of whatever I'm trying to influence by the envelope in the continuous way, in the sustain way. So when I press a key, it takes a little bit of time to build up the effect, and then eventually I want to decay or to drop down into my sustained level. The sustained level is the level that will hold as long as I'm holding the key. So I'm dropping. So what would happen if I take the decay all the way down? It will be immediate. So it will take me a little bit of time to get to the maximum value, but once I'm there, I'm going to drop down immediately to my sustained level. And then eventually, when I release the key, the sound will fade away in the amount of time that is defined by the release. Now, when we're talking about a filter, it's a little bit harder to notice these little changes. But let's try and play with our amplifier here. So let's get that back. And now let's have something here changed for the amplifier. And now if I change my filter envelope to match the release time and the sustain of my amplifier, that can also be very useful. So I know that so far all the sounds sound really boring, but trust me, we'll get there. And the next very important part of our synthesizer is really the LFO. And we already had a glimpse of that, and I'll show you some more uses for LFO and what can we do with LFOs. And we have other ways to manipulate and change the parameters, and we'll go through them and we'll learn a lot of tricks and a lot of little things that can help us shape our sound. So let's go to Pigments for this demonstration. And so in Pigments, I have a very visible way to work here. I can take my LFO and shape it differently, and I can assign it to different parameters. And this is really the secret here. So we saw that any of our oscillators have all kinds of waveforms, maybe width, volume, and tuning, and so on. And we can use our LFO to change any of these parameters. So one of the things that we didn't really cover here is the tuning. So we can see that our oscillator is tuned to a certain frequency, and it is also coupled with our keyboards to match. But what would happen if I change the basic tuning of my oscillator? So right now it's just 0 semitones, and it is tuned with my keyboard. So when I play a note, it is just matching here. But I can change the tuning here to, let's say, 12 semitones up, and then while I'm playing a note in my middle C here, the sound will be 1 octave up, or maybe 1 octave down. So that gives me some ideas of what I can do and what's my playground here. So I can take my LFO and say, hey, let's modulate, let's change the tuning over time. And this is really easy. I'm just going here to my oscillator tuning, and I'll take LFO 1, and let's see what happens. I can see that I'm already affecting my tuning over time. And I can change the waveform to do all kinds of interesting movements on my tuning. So what else can be modulated by LFO? I can also modulate my volume. And again, very easy with Pigments, clicking the plus here and then assigning LFO 2, for example. And now, again, the amount of the modulation will determine the effect here, how the LFO is really affecting our volume in this case. And I can change the waveform again. I can change the rate. And let's go back to our to our tuning here and get that really subtle here. And go back to our volume. And again, I can use the LFO on the resonance, for example, and I can use the same LFO or something else. I can have maybe even both LFOs. And I can play with the type of filter that I have here. Right, so this is really how LFO works. They change our parameters over time, and I can select the shape, the movement here. I can change the rate, and I can have other parameters here, which we'll cover in a separate lesson. So that's what we have so far here. So let's just wrap up and see what we've missed with our Prophet synthesizer. So one of the key elements in any of the synthesizers that I will teach here is that they have several oscillators, and this opens up a lot of possibilities, because we can have one oscillator tuned differently from the first oscillator, and we can create some chords. So let's hear that. And here I have my mixer, and I can introduce oscillator B. I can take oscillator A little bit down. So right now they are tuned the same, but I can have them tuned, for example, differently here. And if you look down to the bottom left, you can see how many semitones I'm changing here. 12 semitones, 1 octave up. But I can do something else. Let's take 7 semitones, 5 semitones, for example. Right, and if we go back to Synth Master, there's other ideas that you can utilize here. Let's go back to our init preset, and I'll show you something. So in Synth Master 2, you can have basic oscillators like the ones that we just saw, all kinds of different waveforms, but I can have, instead of basic, an additive oscillator, and that really splits my oscillator into 8 different oscillators, and I can really build some complex chords here. Let's try it out, and we can see that I have here numbers. That's my base frequency, and I can change that to, let's say, 5 semitones, and that will be 7 semitones. Or maybe something else. Right, so this is really easy to use kind of synthesizer that you see everything in front of you. You can change any of these oscillators and just shape them in a different way. You can select a different waveform for each of them, and you can pan them differently. That can go to the left, this one can go to the right. Different semitones, that can be an octave, for example. That can be something else. Right, so that's pretty much it for this lesson, but I'll give you just one last glimpse of what can be done with synthesizers when you're taking a basic sound and you use it through some effect. So any of the synthesizers that I showed you also have an effect section. And here in Pigments, we have 2 different buses, bus A and bus B, and also a send bus that will go in parallel to everything. So right now, you can see that we have a delay, a reverb on bus A, and the send bus only have its reverb. So let's hear the sound as it comes dry. And let's introduce some reverb. So I'll get the send. So it already sounds very interesting. And if I go back to bus A and introduce my delay here, and maybe some distortion, and going back to my synthesizer, I can just take some of these LFOs maybe down. We don't need all that those changes over time. And this one. So in order for us to get that sound automated, I can actually use an LFO, but let's try and use something else. Let's try and use an envelope. So I can have envelope 2 here, affect our cutoff, and get envelope 2. And I can have also oscillator 2 here come to play, and let's have like 5 semitones up, get the volume. And I can also have oscillator 3 play as well. So this is pretty much it. In our next lesson, we'll cover oscillators in greater depth. We'll go into almost every detail of the oscillators. I'll show you oscillators in all different synthesizers that I have here and how they work. We'll have a look at the wavetables. We'll have a look at some complex waveforms, and we'll see all kinds of things that will get you more understanding of how this is a great tool for our sound design. If you know how to use your oscillators, that's really the basic, that's the foundation of the sound shaping. And once you get that, then of course the next phases will be easier, because that will be the DNA of your sound design. So thank you for staying here and hanging out with me. Let's meet with our next lesson on oscillators very soon. Thank you.